to this podcast, the Heidelminicast.
It's a Heidelminicast. And now, Scott Clark.
Are there really two Reformed views of the Sabbath?
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
It's not hard to find people talking about a continental view of the Sabbath as distinct from the British view of the Sabbath. We find that all over the place. If you just Google it, you'll find people writing about it. It's sometimes argued that the so-called continental view was Calvin's view. From there, people point to the relative brevity of the Heidelberg Catechism on the Sabbath in question 103, and then finally one will likely read something about coxeus on the Sabbath. You might even read something about Calvin bowling on the Sabbath. And the implication is that the so-called continental view is less rigorous than the view one finds in the Westminster Standards. This way of speaking would be quite a surprise to the continental Reformed tradition. So let's define our terms here. The adjective continental in this discussion is a little slippery. It's not always clear what is meant by it. Sometimes it refers to the Dutch Reformed churches. It might include the Germans, the French, and perhaps Geneva. Often, however, judging by usage, it seems to mean Reformed people who don't speak English and who are European. The unstated assumption behind this way of speaking is that there were and are two distinct traditions regarding the Sabbath in Reformed theology, the European, mainly Dutch, and the British and American. Such ways of speaking and thinking would have been foreign to the classical Reformed writers in the 16th and 17th centuries. Yes, they spoke their own vernacular languages, but they all wrote and spoke Latin. They were quite conscious of belonging to a single Reformed tradition. The British Reformed, the Scots, the English, the Welsh, and the Irish were reading the Dutch, German, French, and Swiss Reformed theologians, and vice versa. There was no consciousness in the classical period of a distinctly British or continental view of anything. There was simply an international Reformed theology, piety, and practice.
We're talking about practice. Not a game. We're talking about practice.
Let's consider four cases. I made this argument at length in Recovering the Reformed Confession, so I won't belabor it much here. But a lot of what has been written about Calvin's allegedly continental view of the Sabbath is just not well grounded in sources. What typically happens is that writers appeal to a passage or two from the 1559 Institutes, and then they call it a day. This way of reading Calvin is deeply flawed. The only way to understand Calvin properly is to read him the way he intended to be read. One has to start with his biblical commentary, and then go to a treatise, for example, the Institutes or some other, and then go to his sermons. And when one reads Calvin holistically, in context, his view of the Sabbath is quite difficult to distinguish from that which is alleged to be distinctly and harshly British. The Heidelberg Catechism in 1563 did speak to the Sabbath. Question 103. What does God require in the fourth commandment? In the first place, God wills that the ministry of the gospel and schools be maintained, and that I, especially on the day of rest, diligently attend church, to learn the word of God, to use the holy sacraments, to call publicly upon the Lord, and to give Christian alms. In the second place, that all the days of my life I rest from my evil works. Allow the Lord to work in me by his Spirit, and thus begin in this life the everlasting Sabbath. Ursinus' lectures on the Christian Sabbath were translated into English and available to students at Oxford University by 1587, where his lectures on the Catechism were a part of the curriculum. In his explanation of this question, Ursinus observed, and I quote, that the first part is moral and perpetual is evident from the end and the causes of the commandment, which are perpetual in their character. The end or design of the commandment is the maintenance of the public worship of God in the church, or the perpetual preservation and use of the ecclesiastical ministry." Close quote. He wrote that the second part of the commandment is distinctly Mosaic, ceremonial, and temporary. He distinguished between the Israelite Sabbaths and the Sabbath. The Sabbath itself was grounded in creation. It is part of the abiding moral law of God. He distinguished between servile works for example, those that hinder worship, and necessary works. Third, though we think mainly about the Synod of Dort in 1618-1619 in regard to the doctrine of salvation, the Reformed churches actually met there to discuss more than the doctrine of salvation, more than responding to the remonstrance. They discussed the life of the church, and they formulated a position on the Sabbath that is not clearly distinct from what was held by most British Reformed congregations and confessions. The Synod distinguished between that which is perpetual or creational and that which was temporary or Mosaic in the Sabbath. The intent, however, of those rules, the canons of the Synod of Dort on the Sabbath, adopted in May of 1619, was to make clear that the Sabbath is not abrogated along with the old Mosaic covenant. And that's, I think, really important in this discussion.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
Fourth, it is frequently asserted or implied that Johannes Cocceius, who died in 1669, corrupted the Reformed consensus on the Sabbath. For example, the Theopedia entry claims, quote, in one of his essays, he contends that the observance of the Sabbath, though expedient, is not binding upon Christians since it is a Jewish institution. The picture in the original text is more complicated. In sections 21 and 338 of his Summa de Foedera, he recognized that the Sabbath was a creational institution. He taught that it had perpetual validity. He recognized that the Mosaic Sabbath legislation was moral in nature, while acknowledging that the punishments attached to it under Moses were temporary and that there were other temporary aspects to the Mosaic legislation. He also observed the eschatological, that is the heavenward-looking, aspect of the Sabbath. His doctrine of progressive abrogation of the covenant of works caused him to argue that the Decalogue was not a covenant of works. He was adamant that the covenant of grace was administered through the Mosaic legislation. These sections of his Summa are difficult, but it seems clear that he taught that the Jewish Sabbath was a type and shadow of the future Sabbath rest that would be given in the new covenant. Nevertheless, he wrote, it remains true that the Sabbath rest of the New Testament must be observed together with its sanctification. In every possible way, the New Testament's Sabbath rest can be considered and practiced and maintained. Close quote. It's probably the case that there is more to say about Cocceius on the Sabbath, and I recommend the work of Casey Carmichael on that. There were Cocceians who, because of the heated polemical context of the fight with the Fusians, took stronger, less conservative views of the Sabbath, and I'm not confident we can read those views back into Cocceius, just as we can't read the adoption by some Cocceians of the Cartesian philosophy and theology back into Cocceius himself. Yes, there is some diversity within classical Reformed theology on the Sabbath, but it is a diversity within unity. There is a fundamental unity that God has established a 1 in 7 pattern in creation. To that creational law was added typological and temporary Mosaic legislation. But the Sabbath was not grounded in the Mosaic law and covenant, but rather in creation, that is, in the nature of things. The Sabbath principle then remained in force in the new covenant. That day was transformed from the last day of the week to the first day of the week, Sunday, by the bodily resurrection of the Son of God and the inauguration of the new covenant. But the Sabbath principle and practice remain.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by HeidelbergReformationAssociation.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
The best podcast.